Roxanna Islam is the head of sector and industry research for TMX Vetify and was with us here today. And we're going to talk about ETFs, which have just been so popular lately. And I want you to go into some depth here with ETFs. There's active versus passive ETFs, and things have changed. I mean, where are you seeing change and evolution in the ETF space?
Yeah, so first of all, great to be here, Jane. Great question. ETFs are definitely always been on the forefront of change. So, traditionally these ETFs, they've been known as these passive vehicles, meaning they follow an index. And some of the larger passive ETFs that are household names to us, there's VOO, for instance. And if you're not familiar with that, by the way, that's Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF. These ETFs, they're straightforward, they're simple, low cost, and that's really what makes them desirable. But active ETFs have really come into the spotlight recently, and they've just seen higher and higher share each year. And in 2025, we've actually already seen 500 plus ETF launches this year, and almost 90% of those were active. So, that really makes a lot of investors and advisors think, is all the new innovation now just in active strategies? But even though there are less of these passive ETF launches, these strategies are still innovative. And I think it's important to remember that passive just refers to the management style, meaning it's indexed to a benchmark, not that it lacks conviction or that, it's a lazy idea. So I think that's key to remember when you're thinking about active versus passive.
Okay. Are there differences in fees between passive and active?
Yeah, so in general, passive are lower cost. And, that's, as I explained, I think that's sort of one of the key features is, they're a little bit more simple. They're more straightforward. So that's why they have those lower costs. And active, you have the active management that goes behind them with the fund manager. So you typically pay a higher premium for those.
Now, you mentioned innovation in the ETF space, so explain what's happening there.
Yeah, so, I think there's still a lot of innovation happening in passive. And really, the backbone of these ETFs are the indexes that underlie them. And index construction, it's been able to become more sophisticated, more targeted over the past few years. They've really just started to evolve to reflect investor priorities. So they're not always these large, plain vanilla funds, as you'd call them. So many of them actually do have an active feel now. So, there's three categories that I would sort of categorize these new passive launches into. So the first is something I'd like to call, a fresh take on new ideas. So it's tweaking traditional indexes with proprietary weighting or security selection methods. And then there's also access to these newer niche asset classes. Crypto equities is a big one that, a lot of people bring up. And then there's one that, is probably my favorite. It's defining new thematic industries or defining boundaries of new areas. And that's using custom indexes to represent areas that are traditionally underrepresented and maybe don't fall into these traditional sector definitions.
Yeah, no, interesting. I just did an interview with somebody who started a music industry ETF, and it's actually doing very well. So I think it fits perfectly with this new evolution. And how are the passive ETFs so evolving?
Yeah, so maybe I can give a few examples of these passive ETFs because there's actually been quite a few that have launched this year in 2025 that have been good examples of this. So when you think about taking an older index and modifying it into something a little bit more complex, one of the ones that I like is the Alger Russell Innovation ETF. It's ticker INVN. So that was really interesting, prioritizes high free cash flow margin in the Russell 1000 index constituents, and then it ranks the remaining ones by R&D as a percentage of enterprise value. So really a cool, creative way to focus on that innovation. Franklin also has two ETFs. There's one that's US and one that's international. The tickers are XUDV and XIDV. So those are dividend multiplier ETFs. So they actually target 2 to 3 times the dividend of the underlying index. And that might sound like leverage, but it's actually an optimization process that does that. And when you're talking about these new asset classes, I did mention crypto equities. A great example of that, something that came out earlier this year, is Bitwise's ONB. That one is a really cool product. It targets corporations that hold 1,000 Bitcoin. So it's a new, interesting way to access crypto and companies that are on the forefront of embracing things like that. And then when you're looking at these, defining thematic or even these faith-based areas, some of the ones that I think are interesting are JLens has an ETF with ticker TOV. It's a Jewish advocacy ETF. So it screens out companies that don't align with Jewish values. And then the remaining ones are ranked by a Jewish scorecard. Then lastly, ALPS has an ETF with ticker ELFY. So that one focuses on electricity demand and the newly popular electrification theme. So if you look under the hood of that, it's utilities, industrials, technology. So it's a theme that doesn't quite fit into those traditional sector boundaries, which is why it's important to define that using these indexes.
Oh,
So Vetify, yeah, in Vetify we actually provide one of the services we provide asset managers is indexing. So we actually provide the underlying index for several of those ETFs I mentioned: XUDV, XIDV, TOV, and ELFY.
And it almost feels like the number of ETFs could be unlimited with look at all these kind of specializations. Absolutely fascinating. Now, why does it matter? I mean, ETFs, there's transparency, there's efficiency, there's kind of, a little bit of risk tolerance as well. So explain why this is important to investors.
Yeah, so innovation in passive ETFs in particular, I think it allows investors to align portfolios more with their goals without sacrificing some of the key characteristics that we love about ETFs, and that's transparency and efficiency. These are characteristics that are really major benefits of passive over active. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it's not just these plain vanilla ETFs anymore. Passive ETFs have become this dynamic toolkit for investors to express their views and express their choices. So while there is a lot of innovation in active ETFs, and I expect to see that continue, there's also a lot of innovation in these passive ETFs and their indexes. And this is also an area that I think will just grow and develop rapidly.
Oh, fascinating. I had no idea there were so many, and it's wonderful for investors to have so many choices to pick from. So, Roxana, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane.